Welcome, students. We will take some notes on the Reagan years. We will take some notes on other things about Reagan, such as Reaganomics, which is a different section of notes, and also the end of the Cold War. But we'll focus on a general review of the Reagan years. Keep in mind that this is not an extensive look, but this is something you should be taking notes on. So the 1980s was the rise of the conservative movement, known as the moral majority. So the 1980s was a backlash to the 1960s and 1970s. It was a time period when parents and other individuals wanted to get away from the corruption of the Vietnam War and the death of the Vietnam War and the terrible economy and really get back to morals. This is an increase in technology during this time period. You'll have the birth of MTV, which is music television, which will debut in 1981. You'll also have cable news network known as CNN. And the term yuppies becomes the term for most young individuals. If you remember, the 60s and 70s was the hippies, where there was a lot of culture, a lot of anti-government and anti-war rhetoric. But during the 80s, there's not so much of a backlash to that. During the 80s, you have these yuppies that are young professionals that are working generally in the cities. So you have people focusing not so much on the social problems of the day and protests and such, but they're focusing more on themselves and their own professional working careers. They'll also have an AIDS epidemic that will happen during this time period. And it's recognized during this time period. It would break out in the 60s and 70s, but there's mixed feelings. It's not until Reagan's second term that he starts to fund any research against AIDS. So Reagan is known by most people as a very positive president. However, people will attack him for his limited stance on feminism, on homelessness, and on AIDS. Those are three things that he really doesn't get involved with. Ronald Reagan, as a professional, he's a former actor. He was actually part of the Screen Actors Guild and the spokesman for that, also the spokesman for General Electric. He went into politics, becomes California's governor. He actually, in his early years, used to be a Democrat, but he changes to a Republican over issues of government involvement in healthcare, and so he'll become a conservative spokesperson against universal health care by the government. He's nicknamed as the Great Communicator because his speeches and his communication was just amazing. He was really funny with his one-liner jokes. He's also known for his economic and foreign policies. Those are the two things he's really well known for. As I mentioned before, we'll take some other notes on his Reaganomics, his economic plan, and we'll also take some other notes on his end of the Cold War with his foreign policies. Let's keep going. So conservative moods, if you remember, liberal means progressive, means to look forward. Conservative means to value the past and to look to the past. So he's going to appoint 3 conservative Supreme Court justices. Very important. Sandra Day O'Connor was the first female Supreme Court justice. That was pretty significant. Antonin Scalia would recently die, and he was a very conservative Supreme Court justice as well. A lot of swaying that he did, and also Anthony Kennedy. And so appointing these 3 conservative Supreme Court justices really brought about a lot of conservative rulings in the Supreme Court. You'll need to know those 3 names, so I definitely write those down. Congress passed the Equal Access Act, which allows religious groups equal access to public school facilities, meaning that you can have Christian clubs during lunchtime that students can voluntarily go to. Before this, you had school districts that were banning any type of religious involvement that was chosen by students. So as long as students are not being forced into religion, the Equal Access Act protects those voluntary religious groups to be able to go on campus. Big on shifting power back to the states instead of the federal government during the Lyndon Johnson years. You'll have a shift back to the states. Didn't focus too much on social agenda. So as Lyndon Johnson and his Democratic Progressive Great Society focus a lot on social engineering and social networks, social helps and such for poor people and those in need and elderly. The conservative movement would really kind of put that to the back burner. Reagan politics, as I mentioned before, Reagan made an effort to build relationships between election and inauguration. Early assassination attempt helps build support. So he would be targeted for an assassination. He does spend some time in the hospital as a result of it, but he does survive. That really kind of builds this image that he's kind of a Superman tough president. Major tax reforms, lowered taxes significantly. We'll talk about that with Reaganomics in another section, but that's important. The initial Cold War actions, President presented a strong front. We held the high ground. So when it comes to the Cold War, we take the high ground in this instead of backpedaling, instead of the poor reputation from the Vietnam War, we rise above that. Increased defense spending. Believed the USSR would crumble trying to keep up. So this was a way to spend a lot of money on our military so that Russia would try to do the same thing to keep up, but then show that communism doesn't work. And so the buildup of our military would help the Russians to basically give up communism and realize that it's not sustainable. Push the Strategic Defense Initiative. You'll definitely need to know this for the test. Space-based missile defense system. Made the USSR very nervous. Now, SDI was never actually fully realized. We were trying to create a system where we had satellites be able to shoot down missiles and protect us like a covering. But just the thought that we were pursuing this and that we could made the USSR very nervous and end up, many say that SDI was what brought the USSR, Russia, communism down. Reagan Doctrine. Reagan Doctrine is a foreign policy approach. This declared support for freedom fighters around the globe resisting communism. So this Reagan Doctrine is kind of like the Truman Doctrine. This doctrine of almost like containment. Now, this isn't containment in that we're sending necessarily troops, but we are sending support. Oftentimes, it does come in the in the way of troops. For example, we will fund the Mujahideen guerrillas fighting the Soviets in Afghanistan. So we will actually give weapons to Afghan terrorists to protect themselves against Russian Soviet invasion. Now, at that time, we didn't consider them terrorists, but we are supporting people like Osama bin Laden and those terrorists that end up turning on America during 9/11. We give them weapons so they can defend themselves against the Soviets. The Soviets would know this. The Russians would know this as kind of their Vietnam, because they will never be able to gain Afghanistan. But what we experienced in the Vietnam War, the Russian Soviets will experience in Afghanistan. There's also funding of the Contras against the communist Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So much like Afghanistan, also in Nicaragua, we are helping those who are fighting against communism, giving them weapons. But this will, especially for the Contras in Nicaragua, will become somewhat of a scandal. So make sure that you know Reagan Doctrine, and especially the Contras with the Sandinistas. The Iran-Contra affair, definitely something that will be a stain on Reagan's presidency. Probably the worst. People will call this a contradiction. Let's see. Congress withdrew support of the Contras. So Congress said, hey, we're not going to support these Contras that are freedom fighters fighting against communism. But Reagan still wants to. So Reagan will, his staff will create a deal. Reagan agreed to sell weapons to Iran in exchange for release of several U.S. hostages. And so we sell them weapons. But the question is, what do we do with that money? We can't let Congress know that we're giving the Iranians weapons because we want hostages back. So a few of his aides redirected the funding from the arms of the sales to the Contras, defying Congress. And so we take that dirty money, so to speak, and we give it to the Contras in Nicaragua. So this is known as the Iran-Contra affair. Reagan's involvement is unknown. He does apologize to the nation. But he's able to, he's known as a Teflon president, which means Teflon means no stick. Anything that's negative really doesn't stick to the president because he's able to communicate his way out of it. And so Ronald Reagan, he is not a president that is in knowledge of everything. He trusts a lot of his cabinet members. So there is a potential that maybe he didn't know about this Iran-Contra affair. He's not like a, who is that Democratic president in the late 70s, Jimmy Carter, who scoured over every memo, knew everything. Jimmy Carter micromanaged the presidency and even fired his cabinet because he wanted to run the show. Reagan's a different guy. Reagan, he puts people in positions that are good at their job and they make him look good. He's not a fast reader. He's not good at meetings. He's good at communicating. He's good at leading. So he trusts his subordinates. So if his subordinates do something wrong, he's able not to take the blame for it. And he ends up being able to cut them. And so Oliver North was a high-ranking general that would testify about his involvement. He would actually be sent to prison as a result of this. So he takes the brunt of this Iran-Contra affair instead of the president. Go ahead and submit those notes to Google Classroom, and have a great day.